And greetings, saints of the Most High. Welcome to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. Rod Thomas coming to you on a soaked with threats of thunderstorms from the DFW. And I understand, and my prayers are with all of you who may be on the eastern, south, southern, and even northern corridors of our nation who are enduring and having to combat with some really adverse weather conditions. My prayers are out there with you, and let's keep the faith, brethren. Let's just keep together and pray for one another. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me here on this preparation day. And as always, beloved, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of TMTO finds you, your families, and your fellowships well and blessed. Well, as I am publishing this discussion, it is the 5th day of the month of the Aviv 6025, which translates to April 4, 2025. And I pray you are having a meaningful and blessed month of the Aviv. Allow me to share some of my thoughts and reflections on Torah Reading 24 with you today. It's been a while since I've done a thoughts and reflections on the Torah Reading, and I figure today is as good a day as any. And I've been led to title this discussion, Learning to Leave Well Enough Alone. Again, learning to leave well enough alone. And I guess the title will become evident as we go along. And our reading is found in Genesis or Bereshit, chapter 26, verses 12 through 35. Genesis or Bereshit, chapter 26, verses 12 through 35. The reading before us is a carryover from Torah Reading 23. So before we dive or really get too deep into this week's reading, let's consider the essential elements of last week's reading. Yehovah reaffirms the covenant he has with Isaac, Yitzchak. And Yah promises in Torah Reading 23 that 1, he would be with Yitzchak, 2, he would bless him, 3, he would give him and his descendants the land, 4, he will do to Yitzchak, Isaac, what he swore and did for his father Abraham. And 5, Yah would multiply Yitzchak's descendants like the stars of heaven, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Yitzchak's or Isaac's offspring. Yitzchak did nothing to deserve Yah's favor. But Yah chose Yitzchak to cut a covenant with because Abraham listened to Yah's voice. Abraham kept Yah's charge. Abraham kept Yah's commandments. Abraham kept Yah's statutes, and Abraham kept Yah's laws. Genesis 26, verse 5. So as the story goes back in Torah Reading 23, Isaac, Yitzchak, settles in Gerar. And he does this out of obedience to Yehovah, that he remain in Canaan proper despite there being a famine in the region. Now, Gerar is about 20 miles southeast of present-day Gaza, in the Negev. And Abimelech was king of Gerar at the time, and Yitzchak had settled in Gerar because of that famine that had overtaken the region. Yitzchak has a run-in with Abimelech when Yitzchak creates and tries to perpetuate a similar rouse to his father, the rouse that Rebekah, his wife, was his sister to, reduce the chances that the men of Gerar would kill him because, Rebekah was quite desirable. Abimelech learns Rebekah was, in fact, Yitzchak's wife and makes the whole of Gerar, the men of Gerar, know that Rebekah and Yitzchak were off limits under threat of death. So Abimelech puts out, don't touch Rebekah, which in effect means don't touch Abraham either. because Abimelech knows what he'd be up against if such a thing were to happen. We saw this very thing, as I mentioned, happen 60 years or 6 chapters back involving Yitzchak's parents, Avram and Sarai, in chapter 20. So, with that background in place, let's go through the reading together. I'm going to be reading from the Scriptures ISR translation. And as we go along, I will go ahead and comment accordingly. So we're in Genesis, or Bereshit, chapter 26. We're going to start at verse 12. And it reads in the Scriptures ISR, "And Yitzchak sowed or planted in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. And Yehovah blessed him." So Yehovah blesses Yitzchak in Gerar as promised. And Yitzchak's sowing nets him 100-fold. The Septuagint specifically states that Yitzchak found in that year of bounty barley that produced 100-fold. Now, this is clearly miraculous. And what makes this even more miraculous, beloved, is that this abundant 100-fold harvest that Yitzchak enjoyed came amid a severe regional famine. Imagine that. This is a partial fulfillment of Yah's covenant promise to him. Moving on to verses 13 and 14. And it reads, "And the man grew great," the man being Yitzchak, Isaac, "and went forward until he became very great." Verse 14. "And he came to have possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great body of servants. And the Philistines, of course, were envious of him. They envied him." So Yitzchak prospers in Gerar, having what? Sheep, having cattle, and many servants. And Yitzchak's success in the land resulted in the Philistines of Gerar becoming envious of him. Of course they would. The Septuagint describes Yitzchak's prosperity as him becoming exalted and as him advancing in years such that he became very great in the land. He was a rock star. He was a legend because, hey, look at him. He is exceptional. He is prosperous. And he is great in the land. But the Philistines are extremely envious of him. Let's move on to verse 15. And it reads, "And the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham, his father, and filled them with dirt." So we see here that envy drives certain people absolutely batty, crazy. And in this case, the Philistines act upon their envy by what? Filling the wells that Yitzchak's father Abraham had dug years and years ago. 20 more years, in fact. And the act of Abraham, Yitzchak's father, digging and naming a series of wells in Gerar was an act of showing ownership of the land in which the wells sat. Abraham, in establishing these wells, was effectively establishing his stake, establishing his ownership of that land in which the wells sat, which was promised to him. The land was promised to him originally by Yehovah. But circumstances did not afford Abraham, nor would it afford Yitzchak at the time, the de facto ownership of the land until some generations later. And so Yitzchak's acts of redigging the wells his father had previously dug and reassigning them their original names is an act of honoring the memory of his father and of acting by faith on the covenant promises of Yehovah, laying claim to the land that was promised to him and his posterity. You see, wells were vital to Yitzhak's prosperity in the arid land of Gerar, because without the water from these wells, the Philistines no doubt thought Yitzhak's prosperity would come to a screeching halt, and so that's why they went ahead and buried these wells. Let's move on to verse 16. And it reads, "And Abimelech said to Yitzhak, 'Hey, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we.'" So here we see Abimelech sends Yitzhak packing, charging that he had become exceedingly stronger than his people, the Philistines. Verse 18. Let's go on to verse 17 and 18. And 17 and 18 reads as such. So Yitzhak went from there. He packed up, he pitched his tent. He moved out, pitched his tent in the Wadi Gerar, and dwelt there. I'll talk about the Wadi Gerar in a second. Verse 18, "And Yitzhak dug again the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And he called them by the names which his father had called them." So in verse 17, we see that Yitzhak moves and settles in the valley of Gerar. When we hear this Wadi Gerar, it generally talks about a valley that when it rains, it usually floods. It becomes almost like a river, a wadi over in the Middle East. So he moves and settles in the valley of Gerar, and it's just outside Gerar proper. Thus, Yitzhak sets out to redig the wells that his father previously dug, but that the Philistines, of course, had buried after his father died. And as Yitzhak redigs these buried wells, he names them according to the names his father had originally assigned them. Now, let's talk about this concept, this ancient Middle Eastern concept of naming of wells. Hence the name that I'd given, leaving well enough alone. Learning to leave well enough alone. So what is this thing about naming wells? Well, wells, of course, held deep significance in the ancient Middle East, far beyond their practical use as sources of water. So naming wells was a way to mark important events, of establishing territorial claims, and it symbolized divine provision. So in biblical times, wells were often named to commemorate agreements or to commemorate covenants. For example, Beersheba, meaning well of the oath, is named to commemorate the covenant that would be cut between Yitzhak or Isaac and Abimelech. Wells also served as social gathering places where travelers and locals met, making them central to community life. Additionally, wells were associated with divine blessings, as water was a precious commodity, a precious resource in such an arid region. Naming a well was a way to establish, as I mentioned earlier, ownership and to ensure its legacy for future generations. Some wells were even linked to significant encounters, such as Jacob meeting Rachel at a well, which later became a pivotal movement or moment in biblical history. In fact, it goes all the way, Jacob's naming of that well goes all the way to the Samaritan woman interaction with Yeshua. Jacob's well, that famous interaction where Yeshua reveals that he is the Messiah to the Samaritan woman, and of course, the rest is history. Genesis 26, verses 12 through 35 gives us insight into the challenges that Yitzhak faced with the Philistines over wells, over water rights, and the significance of these water sources or resources in establishing peace and prosperity. Yitzhak's success led to tensions with the Philistines, who stopped up the wells his father Abraham had previously dug some 2 decades earlier. So as Isaac or Yitzhak moved and he reopened these wells, he named them, sometimes after their original names, marking his claim and reinforcing his connection to his father's legacy. And the names reflected the struggles he faced. Esek, contention. Sitnah, hostility, symbolized disputes over water rights, while Rehoboth, wide spaces, peace, signified God's provision and relief. And finally, at Beersheba, Yitzhak, Isaac, encountered Yah in a vision, reaffirming the divine blessing on his life, and of course, the cutting of the covenant between Abimelech and Yitzhak. So this passage highlights how wells were more than just physical water sources. They were tied to inheritance, covenant promises, conflict resolution, and even spiritual encounters. The practice of naming wells might seem unusual to us in the 21st century West, but when you think about it, we still do something similar today. We name places, we give names and titles to experiences, or even personal milestones to give them meaning, to give them relevance, to give them permanence in our minds and in our hearts and in our lives. So in Yitzhak's story, naming wells wasn't just a practical act. It was a way to mark struggles, to mark victories, to indicate, to mark, to highlight divine provision. So perhaps there's a lesson in that for modern life. Whether it's a physical location or a metaphorical well, a challenge overcome, a season of growth, or even a personal commitment, giving it a name can solidify its significance and serve as a reminder of Yah's faithfulness or personal perseverance. So let's get back to our text. Let's look at verse 18. And it reads, "And Yitzhak dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he called them by the names which his father called him." So in redigging the wells of his father, Yitzhak is mindful to name them according to the names Abraham his father had originally named them. Moving on to verses 19 through 22. And it reads, verse 19, "But when Yitzhak's servants dug in the wadi, in the valley, and found a well of running water there," verse 20, "the herdsmen of Gerar strode with Yitzhak's herdsmen, saying, 'Hey, the water is ours.' And he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him." And verse 21, "And they dug another well, and they strove over that one too, and he called its name Sitnah." Verse 22, "And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not strive over that one, over it. And he called its name Rehoboth, and said, 'For now Yehovah has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land.'" So Yitzhak's men dug several wells in the Gerar Valley region, all of which were contested by Gerar herdsmen. And so each well Yitzchak digs, well, he names them to commemorate the various trials he endured at the hands of his adversaries while being mindful of the names that his father had previously given them. So one well was Esek or Esek, which meant injustice, according to the Septuagint, and contention, according to the Lexham English Bible rendering. Then we had the second well, Sitna. According to the Septuagint, it meant enmity. And according to the LEB, it meant hostility. Then the third one we have is Rehoboth, meaning open space. Now Yehovah has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land, verse 22, as you may recall. So despite the continued harassment from the nomads of the region, the herdsmen, who denied Yitzchak access to the wells that he'd redug and named according to the name given them originally by his father, well, Yitzchak did not strive with these hostiles. He chose the route of peace, secure in the promises given to him by the Almighty. This is a lesson in and of itself that we'll talk about in just a moment. Let's go on over to verse 23. And it reads, "And from there he went up to Beersheba." So from here, Yitzchak, in peace, in order to keep peace, he moves from the Gerar ravine or the Gerar valley to Beersheba. So let's look at what's happened here. Yitzchak strove with the Philistines and Abimelech in Gerar proper. So he kind of gets booted out of that. Then he goes to the wadi or the ravine or the valley of Gerar. He contends over 3 wells, which is vital for his prosperity in that region, for his well-being, for his wealth, for his family, for his servants, for his cattle and all. And he contends with these herdsmen, and he has to move from there. And so from the valley of Gerar, he goes up to Beersheba. The Septuagint shows he moves to the well of the oath. This well was aptly named by his father Abraham to commemorate the covenant that he had cut with Abimelech back in chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. The Septuagint, according to the Septuagint. Now, Abraham, afterward, cutting the covenant with Abimelech, planted a field near the well of the oath, and he invoked the name of Yehovah everlasting. Chapter 21, verse 33 of the Septuagint. And what's awesomely fascinating here is that we see Yitzchak repeat what his father Abraham did years before. And so Yitzchak builds an altar, and Yitzchak invokes, he calls upon the name of his God, of Yehovah. Verse 25 of chapter 26, our Torah reading. But not before Yehovah had appeared, that is, Yehovah had manifested himself to him the night before, and Yehovah again reaffirms his covenant with him. He says to Yitzchak, "Do not be afraid." Why do not be afraid? Because he has made enemies of a great many people. He's made them in Gerar proper, and he's made enemies in the wadi area amongst the herdsmen of the valley of Gerar, in the ravine or the whatever, the wadi. So Yah says to Yitzchak, hey, do not be afraid, for I am with you. And look, I will bless you, and I will make your descendants numerous for the sake of my servant Abraham. chapter 26, verse 24. It would appear that the Philistines had also destroyed the well that Yitzchak's father had dug, that being the well of the oath. So the text says that Yitzchak directed his servants to dig another well there. Verse 25. We'll hit that in just a minute. So let's get back to our text. We read verse 23. Now we're going to go to verses 24 through verse 33. Verse 24 reads, "And Yehovah appeared to him," him being Yitzchak, "the same night and said, Hey, I am the Elohim of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you and shall bless you and increase your seed for my servant Abraham's sake." Verse 25, "And he," Yitzchak, "built a slaughter place, an altar there. And he called on the name of Yehovah. And he pitched his tent there, and the servants of Yitzchak dug a well there." Verse 26. I'm sorry, that was 26. Verse 27, I'm sorry. "And Yitzchak said to them, Why have you come to me?" Oh, wait a minute. What did I do? I am so sorry. Let me back up here. I'm using an electronic Bible here, and my mouse jumped several verses. So let's get back to 25. Let me read that one again. Verse 25, "And he," Yitzchak, "built a slaughter place there," or an altar, and he called on the name. He invoked the name of Yehovah. "And he pitched his tent there, and the servants of Yitzchak dug a well there." Verse 26, "And Abimelech came to him from Gerar." Old friend, huh? Just shows up at his tent door. And he shows up with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Pichol, the commander of his army, the commander of Abimelech's army. Verse 27, "And Yitzchak said to them, Why have you come to me? Seeing you have hated me, and you sent me away from you." Verse 28, "But they being Abimelech and his two buddies, they say, We have clearly seen," here's the witness, "we have clearly seen that Yehovah is with you. And we said, Please, let there be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you." Verse 29, "That you do no evil to us." Here we go. Here's the real kicker. "That you do no evil to us, as we have not touched you, and as we have done only good toward you." Really? "And have sent you away in peace. You are now blessed of Yehovah." So they're acknowledging that he is blessed and chosen of Yehovah. Verse 30, "And he made them a feast." Him being Yitzchak. Yitzchak makes them a feast, and they ate and drank. Verse 31, "And they rose early in the morning, and they swore an oath with one another, and Yitzchak let them go, and they departed from him in peace." 32. Verse 32, "And on the same day it came to be that the servants of Yitzchak came and informed him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, We have found water." And lastly, verse 33, "So he called it Sheba. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day." So let's look at all of these verses here. So, as crazy as it may sound, Abimelech, who sent him packing in Gerar, remember a few verses back. Abimelech and his posse, they show up at Yitzchak's tent door, his dwelling, and they propose to Yitzchak that they cut a covenant with him. And so Yitzchak is rightly suspicious of Abimelech's motive, since earlier in the story, as we just said, the ruler sent him and his household packing. But Abimelech allays Yitzchak's fears. And he cites that he and his men recognize he is chosen of Yehovah. Verse 28. And Abimelech reveals that he and his cadre feared him, rightly so. And thus the covenant agreement was not one for trade as usual, but one for goodwill. Abimelech throws out to Yitzchak. He proposes to Yitzchak in the proposal that he and his people treated him and his household with respect, despite sending him away from Gerar. And because he did not seek any ill against him, Abimelech wanted a reciprocal understanding or a reciprocal agreement between them, quote, that you may not do us harm, just as we have not touched you, but have only done good to you and sent you away in peace. You are now blessed of Yehovah. Verse 29. This is all the more interesting given that Abimelech comes to and proposes this covenant to Yitzchak shortly after Yehovah promised to Yitzchak that he need not fear as he is with him, as Yehovah is with him. Verse 24. And so Yitzchak consents to the covenant with Abimelech, and the covenant is ratified with a customary meal between all parties involved, as stated in verse 30. And then the next day, Yitzchak sent Abimelech and his party back to their home in peace, verse 31. And it was on that very day that Yitzchak's servants struck water, inspiring the patriarch to name the place Sheba, which later became known as Beersheba, or the place of swearing, or the place of pledging, as well as a watering place or well of underground water, the well of the oath, verses 32 through 33. Let's wind this reading up with verses 34 and 35. And 34 reads, And when Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Yehudith, the daughter of Beeri, the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. Verse 35, and they were a bitterness of spirit to Yitzchak and Rivkah. So here in verses 34 and 35, Moshe adds to our reading these two verses about Esau, that Yitzchak's son, one, that he was 40 years old, two, he took unto himself 2 Hittite women as wives, and assuming it was because he takes unto himself Hittite wives, he makes life for his parents bitter in spirit. The Septuagint describes the situation between Esau and his parents as, quote, and they were quarreling with Isaac and Rebekah, end quote, verse 35 in the Septuagint. So if anything, these two verses clearly reveal that Esau could not have been the covenant son. And history will bear out that Esau's disposition towards his brother Yitzchak and his parents would haunt their descendants for countless generations to come. Even today, we see evidence of this in regard to the ongoing Israeli-Gaza war. The spirit of Esau is alive and well, for the spirit of Esau seeks to disrupt and destroy the plans of Yehovah, as well as to destroy Yehovah's people. So, what are some of the takeaways from our reading today? Well, Yehovah keeps his promises. Yehovah keeps his covenant promises. Here, he promised to bless Yitzchak, Isaac, despite and amid a regional famine. Back in Torah Reading 23, Yehovah reaffirmed his covenant promises and relationship with Isaac, with Yitzchak. Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 5. And Yehovah swore his affinity towards Yitzchak, declaring that he would honor the same oath he established with his father. Chapter 26, verse 3, because Avraham obeyed him, and Avraham kept his charge, his commandments, his statutes, and his laws. Verse 5 of chapter 26. So, when will we learn that Yehovah is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent? That he said, and will he not do? Or has he spoken, and will he not establish it? Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, the Legacy Standard Bible. We who are taught and led ones of Yeshua are in a covenant relationship with the same Aloha of Avraham, the same Elohim of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So we are sitting on covenant promises that will come to us if we remain in the covenant relationship with Yehovah. Of this, the Apostle Shaul, Paul, wrote to his Ephesian readers. And this is in Ephesians chapter 2. Looking at verses 12 through 16, which reads in the Legacy Standard Bible, remember that you were at that time without Christ. That is the time before coming into covenant relationship with Yehovah through Yeshua. He's talking about the Gentiles of Ephesus. He says, remember that you were at that time without Messiah, alienated from the citizenship of Yasharel, of Yisrael, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Yah in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups, that being Yisrael and us, one, and he made us one, and he broke down the dividing wall of the partition. And he did so by abolishing his flesh, the enmity, the law of commandment contained in ordinance, so that in himself he might create the two into one new man, making peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to Yehovah through the cross, having in himself put to death the enmity. Again, that was Ephesians chapter 2, verses 12 through 16. So the apostle elaborates on this concept of being in a covenant relationship with the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And he does so in a letter in words to his Roman readers when he writes the following. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became a partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, Romans chapter 11, verse 17. Beloved, we are standing on the shoulders of spiritual giants, the patriarchs of our beloved faith. And our heritage is undeniable and it's irresistible. And we must learn to walk in this reality more today than ever. The line dividing those who belong to Yehovah from those that belong to the kingdom of darkness has never been clearer. We must stand and take a side and walk in this reality, this covenant reality. And when we walk in this reality, Yah, like he did for Yitzchak in our reading, will bless and keep us. Unfortunately, walking in this covenant reality doesn't always come without some adversity. Oh, the minions of the kingdom of darkness are quick to recognize those who are sons and daughters of light. And these sons and daughters of darkness are not opposed to coming against the sons and daughters of light, as we see in our reading today. In their recognizing that Yitzchak was blessed and set apart of Yah, the Philistines and herdsmen of the region became envious and set out to take away the sources of his prosperity and blessings. And they did so by trying to destroy the wells. Well, they successfully did, destroying the wells his father Abraham had dug and that he had tried to redig. What wells have we dug in our walk with Messiah that the enemy has come along and taken away from us? How have we responded to these incidents? What significance do we place on these spiritual wells, the naming of them, the remembering of them? Do these wells still hold some significance for us? How have these violent acts of taking these spiritual wells away from us affected our covenant walk and our faith in Yeshua? These are all questions that we must think and come to terms with. Indeed, we dig a lot of wells in our lives, spiritual wells, so to speak. And these wells often mean a great deal to us. Yet the enemy often comes along and he destroys those wells for whatever reason or purpose. Wells such as family, friends, acquaintances, property, possessions, jobs, health, and so forth. And when the enemy comes and he buries those wells in our lives, it falls to us to consider the situation and trust in the covenant relationship we have with the Almighty, because he is our provider and he is our protector, and he will keep his covenant promises. He's not a man that he should lie. He always keeps his word. And yes, our covenant relationship comes at a great price. As I am always accustomed to saying, there are no free lunches out here in life. Yeshua himself taught and he warned that there is a price, and it's often a hefty price that comes with being in a covenant relationship with the Almighty and being a disciple of Yeshua, as described in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. And not only is there a cost associated with giving up all the things we loved from our former lives as pagans in the world, but there are also costs associated with being a child of Yehovah. Of this, our master taught in Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens, of the Shamoim, the Malkut Shamayim. Blessed are you when people insult you and they persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So we see here that the covenant blessings and promises may not always be manifested for us here in the natural, in the here and now. In fact, many of the covenant promises and blessings that belong to us, because of our relationship with Yehovah through Yeshua, our master, are being stored up for us in the world tomorrow. In fact, Master admonishes us, do not store up for ourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for ourselves, for yourselves, treasures in heaven, where neither moth, nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. Again, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. The other lesson to learn from the example of Yitzchak and the adversity he endured for being the covenant son is that we must always seek peace. You see, in ancient times, the act of stopping or burying a once operating well, of which served as a claim to the land upon which it sat, was an act of war. It was a felonious crime. And given Yitzchak's or Isaac's impressive strength that he gained from Yah's blessings, strength not just in material wealth, but also in servants and in manpower, he could have very easily taken out those who set out to destroy his property and threaten his livelihood and well-being. But he didn't. He instead chose the route of peace. And in the end, as we saw manifested in the story of the well of the oath, the enemy gave up. And Yah continued to provide, bless, and prosper Yitzchak as he'd promised. So it is incumbent upon each of us as Yah's set-apart covenant people to always seek Yah's wisdom as it relates to how he desires us to handle the various occasions of adversity that come our way through our walk in Messiah. Invariably, he will lead us to seek the path of peace. Peace should be our default method of dealing with adversity, as the apostle so aptly admonished his Roman assembly readers in Romans chapter 12. Looking at verse 14 through 21, it reads, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. By being the same mind toward one another, not being haughty in mind, but associating with the humble. Do not be wise in your own mind, never paying back evil for evil to anyone, respecting what is good in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, being at peace with all men, never taking your own revenge, beloved. Instead, leave room for the wrath of Yehovah. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says Yehovah. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This, beloved, is the kingdom economy we've been called to walk in. It is indeed contrary to the ways of the world, but at the end of the day, it certifies our covenant relationship with the creator of the universe through our acts of faith and obedience. Our faithful, obedience-based covenant relationship with El Elyon, Yehovah Most High, through Yeshua HaMashiach, is the key to our overcoming the world as our master overcame the world. So, beloved, let us remain steadfast in our conviction and in our profession of faith in Yeshua Messiah in these last and evil days. Let us fully trust in the covenant promises upon which our faith is built. And let us not grow weary in doing good. Galatians 6, verse 9. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Until next time, beloved, take care.